Welcome to True Scary Stories. This is the place where we share real horror stories, paranormal experiences, and mysterious phenomena from around the world. Don't forget to hit like, share, and comment to let us know your thoughts, and make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a scary story. Story 1. The night was heavy with a thick, unsettling fog as the group of paranormal investigators approached the looming structure of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. The building, a monolithic relic from a darker time, stood like a monument to the untold suffering that had taken place within its walls. Once the largest hand-cut stone masonry building in North America, it now sat in eerie silence, the wind howling through broken windows and echoing through the desolate halls. As the team stepped inside, the door creaked shut behind them, sealing them in the chilling embrace of the asylum. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, as if the very walls were weeping from centuries of despair. The group's flashlights flickered weakly, their beams cutting through the oppressive darkness like knives, revealing glimpses of faded murals, rusting medical equipment, and crumbling walls. Suddenly, a faint sound echoed through the corridor. A soft, almost playful giggle, unmistakably that of a child. The group froze, exchanging nervous glances. They had all heard the stories, of course. The tales of Lily, the little girl who was said to have been born in the asylum and who had died there under mysterious circumstances. But hearing that ghostly laughter in the dead of night, deep within the bowels of a haunted asylum, was something else entirely. The leader of the group, a seasoned investigator named Mark, motioned for them to move forward. Their footsteps echoed unnervingly as they made their way down the hallway, the sound seeming to reverberate off the walls and back at them, as if the building itself were alive, breathing and watching. They reached the room that was said to have belonged to Lily, and there, on the dusty floor, lay an old, deflated ball. It was just as the stories had described. Mark bent down to pick it up, and as he did, a sudden chill swept through the room, causing everyone to shiver involuntarily. The temperature had dropped sharply, their breath now visible in the cold, clammy air. The ball suddenly rolled out of Mark's hand, moving slowly at first, then faster, as if an unseen force was playing with it. It bumped against the far wall and stopped. The giggle came again, louder this time, echoing off the walls. The investigators' nerves were fraying, their fear palpable in the suffocating darkness. And then they saw her. A small figure, no taller than a young child, standing in the doorway. Her outline was faint, almost translucent, but her presence was undeniable. She was dressed in an old-fashioned dress, her hair neatly tied with a ribbon. Her eyes, however, were what held their gaze, empty, hollow voids that seemed to suck in the light, radiating an eerie, unnatural darkness. "Lily?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling despite his attempt to remain calm. The little girl tilted her head as if pondering his question. The ball, seemingly forgotten, lay motionless at her feet. Without warning, the door slammed shut, trapping them inside the room. The sound reverberated through the asylum, a deafening boom that sent a jolt of pure terror through the group. Panic set in as they scrambled to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the asylum itself had decided they would not leave. The temperature continued to drop, and the room filled with the sound of footsteps, hundreds of them, as if the spirits of the asylum's tormented past had risen to greet them. The walls began to close in, or at least that's what it felt like, as the darkness seemed to grow thicker, more suffocating. Lily took a step forward, her form flickering like a dying candle flame. The ball rolled back towards the group, coming to a stop at Mark's feet. And then she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight of unimaginable sorrow. "Play with me." The plea was chilling in its simplicity, a desperate request from a lost soul trapped in an endless loop of loneliness and despair. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the walls vibrating with the collective anguish of the asylum's former inhabitants. Suddenly the door burst open and the group, not waiting for another invitation, fled the room. They ran through the corridors, the ghostly giggles following them, growing louder, more insistent. The asylum was alive with the sounds of the past, cries of pain, whispers of despair, and that ever-present haunting laughter. When they finally burst out into the night air, the fog was gone, replaced by a bone-chilling wind. The asylum loomed behind them, silent once more, as if nothing had happened. But they knew better. They had felt the icy grip of the past, the touch of a forgotten child lost in time. As they drove away, no one spoke. The experience had left them shaken, their encounter with the paranormal more intense than anything they had ever experienced before. They knew they would never forget the sound of Lily's laughter, the sight of her hollow eyes, or the cold, unrelenting grip of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. And somewhere, deep within the abandoned halls of that cursed place, a little girl continued to wait, her ball ready for the next visitor, her giggle echoing eternally in the darkness. Story 2. On a moonless night in the heart of Michigan, there lies a forgotten place where the whispers of the past still linger in the cold, damp air. This place is Eloise Psychiatric Hospital, a sprawling complex that once housed the tormented souls of the mentally ill, the lost, and the forsaken. Though its halls have long been abandoned, the spirits of those who suffered there have not found peace. Instead, they wander the decaying corridors, trapped in an endless cycle of agony and despair. The story begins with a young nurse named Margaret. Fresh out of nursing school, Margaret was eager to make a difference, to help those society had turned its back on. But as she stepped through the gates of Eloise for the first time, she felt an icy chill run down her spine. The hospital, with its looming towers and endless rows of windows, seemed to stare back at her, as if it knew what fate awaited her within. Margaret was assigned to the night shift, a time when the hospital was at its eeriest. The dimly lit corridors seemed to stretch on forever, with shadows lurking in every corner. The patients, many of whom were violent and disturbed, would often scream through the night, their cries echoing off the walls like the wails of the damned. But it wasn't just the patients that unnerved Margaret. It was the strange occurrences that began to plague her every night. At first, it was small things. Whispers in the dark when no one was around, the feeling of being watched, and the cold spots that would suddenly envelop her, leaving her breath visible in the air. She tried to brush it off, attributing it to the stress of the job and the unsettling atmosphere of the hospital. But soon, the events became impossible to ignore. One night, as she was making her rounds, Margaret heard the unmistakable sound of a gurney being pushed down the hallway. The wheels squeaked loudly, echoing through the silence. She frowned, knowing that no patients were supposed to be moved at this hour. She followed the sound, her footsteps quickening as the noise grew louder, leading her deeper into the hospital. Turning a corner, Margaret froze. In the dim light, she could just make out a figure at the end of the hallway. A nurse, dressed in the same uniform as hers, pushing a gurney. The nurse's head was bowed, her face obscured by shadows. Margaret called out, but the nurse didn't respond. Instead, she continued down the corridor, the gurney's wheels squeaking eerily. Margaret felt a wave of unease wash over her. Something about the scene was wrong, deeply wrong. She quickened her pace, trying to catch up, but no matter how fast she walked, the nurse remained just out of reach, always turning a corner just before Margaret could get a clear look at her. As she reached the end of the hallway, Margaret found herself standing in front of a door she had never noticed before. It was old, the wood rotting and the paint peeling away, with a small, grimy window at eye level. Through the glass, she could see the nurse standing by the gurney, her back still turned. With trembling hands, Margaret pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound reverberating down the hallway. She stepped inside, the air instantly growing colder, the silence almost deafening. The nurse stood motionless, her hands gripping the handles of the gurney. "Excuse me, ma'am. Can I help you?" Margaret's voice was barely more than a whisper, but it seemed to echo in the cold, empty room. Slowly, the nurse turned to face her. Margaret gasped, stumbling backward. The woman's face was a ghastly sight, pale and hollow, her eyes dark voids that seemed to pull at Margaret's very soul. Her lips were twisted into a grotesque smile, and her skin was stretched tight over her bones, as if she had been dead for years. Before Margaret could react, the nurse stepped forward, her movements unnaturally jerky like a marionette controlled by an unseen hand. The room seemed to close in around Margaret, the walls pressing closer, the air growing thick with the stench of decay. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body was paralyzed with fear. The nurse reached out with a bony hand, her fingers cold as ice as they brushed against Margaret's cheek. "You're just like me," the nurse hissed, her voice a raspy whisper that sent shivers down Margaret's spine. "Trapped. Forever." Margaret's vision blurred, the room spinning around her as the nurse's grip tightened. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was the gurney, where a body lay shrouded in a stained white sheet. And then there was nothing. When Margaret awoke, she was lying on the cold, hard floor of the empty room. The nurse was gone, the gurney nowhere to be seen. But the chill in the air remained, along with the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to her like a shadow. She fled the hospital that night, never to return. But the memories of what she saw, of what she felt, haunted her for the rest of her days. And those who venture into Eloise after dark still report seeing the ghostly nurse, eternally pushing her gurney through the halls, searching for someone, anyone to join her in her endless torment. Eloise Psychiatric Hospital stands as a reminder that some places are never truly empty, that the echoes of the past can linger long after the last patient has left. And if you listen closely, you might just hear the sound of squeaking wheels and the soft, cold touch of a nurse who never left. Story 3. In the heart of Louisville, Kentucky, stands a looming structure, its darkened windows staring out like hollow eyes, watching, waiting. This is the Waverly Hills Sanatorium, a place where the echoes of the past still whisper through the decaying walls, where the air is thick with the weight of thousands of lost souls. It's said that once you step foot on these grounds, you'll never leave the same. Waverly Hills was built in 1910, a beacon of hope for those suffering from the dreaded White Plague, tuberculosis. But what was meant to be a place of healing soon turned into a house of horrors. The disease was relentless, and despite the doctor's best efforts, thousands succumbed to the illness within its walls. Death became a constant companion at Waverly, and with death came the spirits. They say the most haunted part of Waverly Hills is the Death Tunnel, a 500-foot underground chute that was used to discreetly transport the dead away from the hospital so as not to demoralize the living patients. The tunnel's walls are cold, damp, and echo with the sorrow of the many who passed through it. It is a place of profound darkness, both literal and metaphorical. Those who dare to walk its length often speak of hearing faint whispers, the dragging of feet, and even the soft, mournful cries of those who met their end in the sanatorium above. But the death tunnel is not the only place where the spirits linger. The most famous of all Waverly's ghosts haunts the upper floors, room 502. It's here that a nurse, burdened with grief, is said to have taken her own life. The story goes that she was unmarried and pregnant, a scandalous situation in those days. Unable to bear the shame, she hung herself from the light fixture in room 502. Her lifeless body swayed in the dim light, a silent testament to her despair. Since that day, many have claimed to see her ghost, still wearing her nurse's uniform, her face a mask of sorrow. She is often seen standing in the window of room 502, gazing out into the distance as if searching for something or someone long lost. Others have reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread upon entering the room, as though the very air is charged with the agony of her final moments. One particularly chilling encounter occurred late one night, when a group of paranormal investigators decided to spend the night at Waverly. They had heard the stories, of course, but were eager to experience the supernatural for themselves. Armed with cameras, recorders, and other ghost hunting equipment, They set up camp on the 5th floor, just outside room 502. As the night deepened, a thick fog rolled in, wrapping the building in an eerie shroud. The wind howled through the broken windows, sounding almost like a wail. The group huddled together, their nerves on edge, when suddenly, one of their EMF meters spiked. The temperature plummeted, and a feeling of intense sadness washed over them. It was then that they heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from the darkness. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as though someone, or something, was taking its time, savoring the approach. The group turned their flashlights toward the sound, and there, standing in the doorway of room 502, was a figure. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, her head slightly bowed. But what made their blood run cold was her face. Her eyes were dark, empty voids, and her expression was one of utter despair. One of the investigators, a man who had always prided himself on his bravery, felt an inexplicable urge to approach her. He stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached out. But as he got closer, the figure began to fade, dissolving into the shadows. The temperature dropped even further, and a voice barely more than a whisper filled the room. "Help me." The man froze, his breath catching in his throat. The words echoed in his mind, filled with such hopelessness that it brought tears to his eyes. But there was nothing he could do. The figure was gone, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. Shaken, the group quickly packed up their equipment and left Waverly Hills, their spirits as haunted as the sanatorium itself. To this day, they speak of the encounter with a mixture of fear and sadness, convinced that the nurse's ghost is trapped in room 502, forever reliving her final tragic moments. Waverly Hills is more than just an old building. It's a place where the past refuses to stay buried, where the souls of the dead linger, unable or unwilling to move on. And if you ever find yourself there, wandering the dark, empty halls, remember, you're never truly alone. The spirits of Waverly Hills are always watching, always waiting, and they may just decide to make their presence known to you.